Namaste, Jai Hind, and welcome to Viewpoint. We train the spotlight back on China on this edition. A nation that unleashed the pandemic upon the world back in 2019 remained evasive about it till early 2020. A nation that in the past has been the place of origin of the SARS virus, a nation under scrutiny for actively pursuing research in biological weapons, a nation which is on record stating that it is indeed researching and experimenting on various strains of the SARS viruses. But China has got away with it all so far. By making huge donations and contributions to the WHO, it is also accused of misusing its position as the WHO chair in the past, and also blamed for not allowing any proper investigation into the origin and outbreak of the China virus or COVID-19 from Wuhan. But you can't get away with assault on humanity. Karma will play catch up. And with what is happening in China at the moment, one gets the sense that Xi Jinping's time for being held accountable is nigh. 3 years after the outbreak, bodies are piling up. Death toll could cross 10 lakh or more than 1 million. There is no preparedness, no medicines, no infrastructure. In fact, reports indicate that the Chinese are looking for Indian cure and remedies via the black market for the China virus. And a lot among the Chinese just want to get out of China.
This is the result of Xi Jinping's decision to lift China's zero-COVID policy. Bodies are piling up in mortuaries as the country battles one of its worst phases of the pandemic. Experts are predicting that the death toll will reach 1 million. As the situation gets more dire, Chinese are combing through the black market to hunt for Indian drugs. China approved 2 COVID-19 antivirals this year, but their limited supply and steep prices have driven many Chinese to look for cheaper but illegal options. So 4 kinds of generic anti-COVID drugs from India are being sold illegally in the Chinese market.
Government of India has got its own supplies in order, number one. It's China which is facing deficiency of drugs. So basically the local government always has to come out with the deficit of drugs from the system's perspective, and they need to talk to the respective governments. And in this case, Indian government, that we want to have these drugs.
Meanwhile, a US intelligence report claims that China revealed its biological weapons ambition quite a while before the pandemic ravaged the world. The declassified report claims that in 2005, the US State Department publicly stated that China operates an offensive biological weapons program. 2 Chinese entities were specifically identified as likely involved, one of which is the Fifth Institute. The report said that in 2006, China acknowledged that the Fifth Institute specifically researches SARS coronaviruses. But China continues to play hide and seek. From not revealing the truth about the origin of the virus, to concealing the real number of cases and deaths, and hastily lifting restrictions which have triggered the biggest outbreak the world has ever seen. It's been one misstep after another. So who will hold Xi Jinping accountable?
Let's go straight across to our guest. Andrew K. P. Leong, international and independent China strategist, is with us. Dr. Satoru Nagao, fellow non-resident at the Hudson Institute, joining us from Japan. Dr. Sumaya Sheikh, healthcare expert, neuroscientist, is joining us from Australia. Connor Brown, biorisk expert, joining us from Northern Ireland. Namaste, and thank you very much for joining us on this conversation, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to start with Dr. Satoru Nagao. We've had another epidemiologist make an observation that what we are seeing now is a thermonuclear wave. It's a bad wave. This would further affect the entire globe. How is it that one country which is struggling to handle COVID-19, its zero COVID policy has gone bust, it's thrown open all doors and windows, and 3 years down the line, they are not even ready to try and handle a situation of a COVID outbreak in their own country? When the outbreak first started in Wuhan, Dr. And this country has not been held accountable so far. Its leadership has not been held accountable. they have not been made to pay punitive damages for what they've caused to the entire world. Not just loss of lives, but this has crippled nations. What China's unleashed.
Yeah. Viewed from the current situation, what China has done is relatively clear. They do not care about the spread of the COVID-19 in outside of their country. They only worry about situation in their country, but they do not care about the other country. So there is a possibility that the COVID-19 start in China will spread to the other country if we do not stop the flow of the people from China. So that is a very concerning point. And if the new variant has spread in China, a new variant or not decided yet, not identified yet, but if this is a new variant, which is spreading in China currently, in this case, we need to prepare this new variant. So we should stop the flow of the people from China as a preventive measure. That is maybe effective policy we should choose just now. We must defend ourselves because China will not defend us. China's activity will not care about the country around China.
But Dr.
So
Nagao, what is happening
ourselves.
is that a lot of Chinese, this is a report that suggests that a lot of Chinese are making a beeline for Japan. They are living they are buying properties, they are trying to get business management visas, especially the wealthy, and they're making investments upward of $40,000, and then they buy a property and then they get a 1-year visa and they are wanting to stay for the long term in Japan. So Japan is one of the first preferred destinations for Chinese who have had enough of what's going on in China.
Indeed, yes. Currently, many Chinese tourists come to Japan and buy many medicines. So when we go to the medical store, we cannot get medicine for the cold because Chinese tourists has already bought all of it. So suddenly it has happened, and the people was very surprised because we cannot get medicine for cold. But what happened in China, we start to understand, and there is a possibility this is a crisis. So that's why we must prepare the new wave came from China. So that's why we must prepare. So currently Japan will start COVID-19 test of all of the passenger came from China. But at the same time, is it enough? It's a matter of concern. We must stop the flow of the people. That is the most effective
So you're saying
way,
influx of people from China has to stop even as China has opened up its borders and it says that international flights are allowed. Although international travel for its own citizens, it's still working out the policy, but it's openly allowed, said no quarantine, no testing, you can come into China. But who would want to go to China right now? That's another question. Dr. Sumaya Sheikh is joining us from Stockholm in Sweden. I correct myself there. But Dr. Sheikh, how would you see China's handling of COVID overall over the last 3 years? Should this outbreak have happened in China, 5 provinces in the throes, 1 million cases per day, one day itself, the report suggests 37 million cases. In December 2022, in 1 week, there were certain days when such huge spikes have been seen. Nearly 18% of the Chinese population is now in the grips of COVID-19.
Yes, thank you for having me. I think it's right now, things are really bad and very sinister in a way that, they've just opened everything up once again after closing it down. I mean, I'm not an advocate of closing everything down, but what the current government of China is giving a signal to the world and to the population in China that things are becoming better, things are going back to normal after the outbreak, whereas it is very sinister in the way that they are recording deaths. As a matter of fact, they're only recording COVID cases, or rather not even COVID cases, the only people that die from respiratory illnesses with a COVID infection. They're not counting deaths that are, due to other illness, other conditions such as the gut problems, lung problems, liver and kidney and all sorts of problems that come, cardiovascular issues that arise due to COVID infection. So only respiratory deaths have been counted, then stopped even doing the tests for ordinary people. So this is basically artificially truncating the number of COVID infections in China, which is even more sinister because like the world is thinking that, okay, now because the Chinese wave is going down, the rest of the world is going to follow, which is not true. In fact, in Christmas, Australia, where my family is, has one of the largest number of COVID infections, as so with America and other places. So obviously a lot of people are traveling from China and Christmas time, and that is kind of carrying on the infections. And of course, the other issue is the way that the Chinese are considering fully vaccinated people, which is like, especially after so many waves, and the latest one in particular, double vaccinated is longer considered fully vaccinated because everybody knows that 2 doses of vaccine after 6 months or beyond, even 3 months or beyond, has no meaning. You have to give a booster dose, specifically those who are at risk of mortality and COVID, infections. So I think double dose, majority of the people are double dosed. Very few amount of people are with the third dose. So I think that is also causing a problem. The third thing is that the Chinese vaccine, the indigenous vaccines that are mostly given, the Sinovac and Sinopharm, they are not good vaccines. I mean, the Sinovac is another inactivated vaccine, just like the indigenous Covaxin that India has prepared, but it is much, much lower even beneath Covaxin. Covaxin has about 77% efficacy in the studies, and Chinese inactivated vaccine is around, yes, exactly. So it's below 50, and they're still given. And it's still given not just to the Chinese in China, but also people outside. So, for example, a lot of people in UAE has had it. Germany has now considered giving that to just Chinese people in Germany. I mean, what sort of logic is that? So I think this vaccine is absolutely rubbish, and it should not be given a chance, especially when there are so many better vaccines available for a country like China, because it's not just about China anymore. It's impacting the entire world, as we've seen in the last 3 years or so. So I think
the other additional concern is not just the efficacy of Sinovac or Sinopharm. The fact is that it says that 2 doses of Sinovac is not enough. You need to give at least 3 doses. And China has not been able to even vaccinate or inoculate its own population thrice. A large number of senior citizens have perished because they have not been given priority. They say, okay, their lives are dispensable. Is that the attitude that one should have? But 3 years down the line, there was a phase when nations did not know what to be done, what needs to be done. That was the first year. By the time the second year happened, nations started prepping themselves. Nations like India, which share similar of the 1/5 of the world's population like China today, manufactured their own PPE kits, started getting their own infrastructure in place. Vaccines were done. Inoculation drive was done. Nearly 2 billion vaccines have been administered in our country. But, Connor Brown, can China be allowed to get away for its ill-preparedness, for its inefficient medicines, and the way they have handled their own people, COVID in their own country?
Well, I don't really like the use of the term "get away." That implies that they should be held accountable for something, which I don't think is actually the case. I think what's happening in China right now is an absolute humanitarian tragedy, and as previous commentators have discussed, the reason for that happening is because they were vaccinating with a low efficacy vaccine against the Omicron variant. And one thing that I would also say as well is that 3 doses of the vaccine, of all vaccines, even mRNA vaccines, are required for good protection against Omicron. So I'm not quite sure what you're really asking me with regards to your question. The situation in China is basically because the Chinese wasted time. They had about a year, as you mentioned before, to inoculate senior citizens with 3 vaccinations and to inoculate most of their population with 3 vaccinations. But the problem is, of course, unlike many other countries in the world, they've never had an actual wave of COVID-19. So there exists no natural immunity within their population. And that's one of the big reasons as well that we're seeing such a very, very, very large number of illness and fatalities in China right now.
So would you then critique their zero COVID policy? Was their zero COVID policy or their approach, what they followed for the first 2 years where they claimed great success, was that flawed?
I think the idea wasn't flawed. I think the execution was flawed. So basically, if China had actually used the time that it had gained through the utilization of zero COVID, in other words, zero COVID was about buying time, right? If China had used that time effectively by fully vaccinating its population, concentrating on its elderly population especially, because of course this is the big problem that China has. The most vulnerable elements of Chinese society, which of course are vulnerable, are elderly people, are the group of people that are the least well vaccinated. So this is their big mistake. But the concept itself was a good one. The problem is that they wasted time. They had a full year to even with the double vaccination of their inactivated vaccines, they could have boosted with an mRNA vaccine or any other high efficacy vaccine and protected their population. That would actually have worked. But the problem is they didn't do that. So now we're in a situation where we have unchecked transmission in China as a result of the Chinese government, for one reason or another, wasting a year of zero COVID. So that was the problem. It wasn't zero COVID was a good idea. It was executed very, very, very badly.
Do you believe the timing of them trying to throw open the borders and going from zero COVID policy to no COVID checks, just opening it up, was that right? And when I talk about accountability, is a nation which is responsible for the origin of the virus, for the last 3 years has not been honest with its numbers. It's not shared the actual numbers of COVID right from February 2020 onwards. It has bulldozed its way with the WHO. It did not allow the team of experts who came from WHO to freely, independently go ahead and also investigate the origin of the virus, whether it leaked from the lab or it came from a fish marketplace. Look at the cause, look at the effect it has had on the entire globe, nations. And that's where I'm asking, should there not be accountability? And now 3 years down the line, because of what's happening in China, the entire world is going to witness yet another wave and surge. This is not something which nations would want.
No, of course not. Of course not. But whenever you talk about a country being held accountable, you have to realize that the vast weight of evidence indicates that the virus, the SARS-CoV-2 virus, originated through zoonotic transfer in China. The idea that the virus leaked from a lab is not by any means the dominant theory for the origin of SARS-CoV-2. The dominant theory is that the virus arose naturally in China. So something that happened as a natural event is not necessarily something that a country should be held accountable for. What happened in China could quite frankly have happened anywhere in the world.
But although there are whistleblowers from China, there are scientists from China, there are investigative reports that have been done by Australian journalists which very clearly prove that there is nothing zoonotic. This is an artificial virus that was being manufactured which is being experimented upon in a lab in Wuhan. So there are contrary studies. You're welcome to hold your view, but let me bring in Andrew K.P. Leong. The way you have handled it, the implementation of zero COVID policy is a failure. How China is going about right now or has gone about it has brought upon this distress on the Chinese people. Andrew K.P. Leong.
Well, there's been a great deal of mudslinging and blackening of China and finger pointing. But in spite of all this, China has just announced it's now downgraded the whole pandemic into a category B infections, because based on scientific evidence, the death rate, even though rising, but overall, it's been extremely low. And of course, as pointed out, it's affected the vulnerable groups, the elderly group. I mean, the previous interviewee was right that China lost a bit of time towards the end in getting the infection rate higher for the elderly group. But there was a great deal of vaccine resistance amongst the elderly, and China did not impose it on them. So there's a bit of time lost, but nevertheless, the overall tendency is more or less the same as other countries. The pandemic has more MORPH, DED into an endemic, and hence that all restrictions now, apart from wearing masks, have been lifted as from I think tomorrow. And then foreigners are allowed in without any quarantine, provided they take a RAT test 48 hours beforehand, and they will not subject to any more restrictions. And also the border between China and Hong Kong has been opening. It will open as from tomorrow. So everything is now back to normal. But of course, the Chinese population, the vast majority of them, have been under lockdown for 3 years, and a lot of the people have lost patience. And now then the restrictions have been lifted. They don't know what to do. There is a kind of panic there. And of course, people say, oh, my friends are infected. But now, as reported only a couple of hours ago, a lot of young people seem to be, taking it in their stride, in the sense that, well, my friend's been infected after 3 or 4 days and it's getting well. It's just like another flu. But it doesn't mean that it's, of course, is always the case. There are bound to be people who have sort of existing
So you are Andrew Kepiliung, clearly saying 3 years of lockdown had people frustrated to an extent that they were ready to blow. That China was ready to internally blow up. That's what we saw, the series of protests, and it's that pressure that's pushed the government to try and open up everything. So when earlier your death rate, it's quite surprising, Andrew Kepiliung, that the kind of impositions Chinese authorities implemented on nations, an entire country was under lockdown phase similarly in multiple provinces, multiple cities. That was all imposed, that was forced upon. You would barge into homes and sanitize the entire house without anybody's permission. And that was done, but you could not inoculate the people. You could not vaccinate the people. You could not get people to go ahead and vaccinate themselves because that you didn't want to impose upon. Everything else you imposed. The authorities imposed. Somewhere this argument doesn't seem to hold so much of water or is not so convincing. I just want to put out some more information there. And then I'll come back to you, Andrew. China's zero COVID policy, this actually backfired. Why? What it did? Every known case, even asymptomatic, was mandatorily hospitalized. What it led to was that a vast majority of population hasn't been infected. And as a result, like some of our experts were saying, has no immunity. What it also did, small outbreaks triggered hard lockdowns. And what it led to was fast-spreading variant like Omicron, which are managing to break through. Then, what it did, suspected cases and their contacts were kept under isolation. Virus was able to spread rapidly after encountering pool of susceptible people. So everything, the learnings that you should have got from the Spanish flu, the learnings that you could have got from other nations, and also the first 2.5 years of COVID-19 pandemic and how nations went through it, those learnings were not taken into account. Experts sounding an alarm for China. 60% of the population could be infected in the next 3 months. The death toll could rise to 500,000 people by April. Number of deaths likely to go up to 1.6 million by the end of 2023. 70% of Beijing's population is now hit by the new Omicron strain. So is this the right way to go about things, Andrew Kepiliung? Are you convinced what the Chinese authorities have done is right? Or is this only going to further complicate matters, not just for China, but unleash a fresh wave in many parts of the world?
Well, have you finished your side of the story? Well, you might respond. Obviously, China has got a fifth of the humanity on the planet within its nation. And then China
so does India.
Extremely successful in not allowing...
India has 2.1 billion vaccines administered. Another 1 lakh vaccines of precautionary doses were administered voluntarily today.
Can I continue, please? You mustn't interrupt me. Otherwise, I would just
please
get
complete.
off.
Please complete.
Don't invite me on to your show. You would keep on...
No, please complete. Okay?
Well, China has been relatively very successful in not allowing the pandemic to spread from province to province. You have a fifth of humanity on the planet in this nation. So China has achieved the world's lowest infection rate and the lowest death rate by any account, even though it's rising amongst the elderly people, as I just explained. The China is now changing into a targeted approach, targeted towards the elderly, targeted towards the people with existing conditions, and also targeted to elderly homes. But for the rest of the people, yes, the infections are rising, but it's just like another serious case of flu. I mean, people get it when they get well in a week or so. Now there is a problem with lack of medicine because all of a sudden people are required to self-test. And there is a government is no longer imposing this mandatory test on them. And so there was a mad rush to get medicine, and hence this is the reason. So, now I admit that China, of course, lost precious time in not forestalling this eventuality. Is bound to happen with any country as the pandemic is eventually, peter out, as with any kind of virus. So they lost some time in getting prepared, in stocking up the medicine, educating the people. But doesn't mean it's a failure. It's a tremendous success, I would say.
Well, you mount a very stirring defense, Andrew. I'm just going to allow me to just take it to our other panelists, Dr. Satoru Nagao.
It's going to last for the next couple of months.
You mount a stirring defense, sir, but I would like to very respectfully say that India also carries a fifth of the planet's population. India has administered more than 2.1 billion vaccines. Even today, voluntarily, more than 1 lakh precautionary doses have been administered. Sir, in India and a nation which has fifth of the world's population, priority and primacy was given to the senior citizens when the vaccines were developed, that they should be vaccinated first. China is doing all of that 3 years later. So all that China did is trying to unlearn and then relearn. It didn't learn, it didn't follow from the world. And 3 years are not enough for you to have a stockpile of vaccines, have a stockpile of testing kits when you are busy trying to sell it at 4 times the cost to other nations when the pandemic broke out. When you are inflating the cost of testing kits, inflating the cost of vaccines, inflating the cost of PPE kits and putting nations under pressure, and you don't have enough now 3 years later to continue to help your own citizens. Dr. Satoru Nagao, somehow this defense doesn't fly, sir. One would want to...
Simply we can say, we can trust India and we cannot trust the Chinese government. Because Chinese government, what about such kind of information? We cannot trust the information of the Chinese government. Even if the Chinese in Chinese continent do not trust the information came from their government. So under such kind of situation, we are confident to say we can trust India, but we cannot trust the Chinese government. So we must defend ourselves. That's the only solution. That's the only way. We cannot trust Chinese government. Because that's the current situation, I think.
No, it's not just about trust. It's about sharing and transparency, sharing information. And where there is criticism, India was criticized during the second wave. The whole world was trying to pounce upon India and question its COVID management. But where we were, it was a 2.5-month cycle where it was very, very critical. After that, India emerged out of it. People came out and got themselves vaccinated. There was a vaccine campaign which was done. China has the same 2 vaccines. India has 2. India was manufacturing 2 vaccines. We have got digital records of everything. China also has got digital imprints and records. But have they approached COVID the wrong way? Have they got it all wrong? Has the leadership got the approach wrong? Dr. Sheikh, doesn't the empirical evidence point in that direction?
Well, I agree that the whole world should share.
Andrew, Dr. Sheikh, please. And then I'll come back to you, sir, for a quick comment. Yeah, Dr. Sheikh.
It's the real question that we've got to ask is holding Chinese government accountable right now, is that really going to translate to good scientific results or good clinical results? I think that's one of the biggest questions to ask. Or should we just, look after ourselves and, look out into our home countries and, deal with the way that COVID can be managed in our home countries? The second thing that we've got to ask is, despite having the access to, I don't disagree in the way that the lockdown managed is extremely bad. There are two sides to this argument, and hear me out. Because Australia is very similar. Unless and until you don't have vaccines, and if you want to prevent those deaths, put your country into lockdown, and if you can manage that economically and all the other ways that you can do so, it's a good idea. It's not a bad idea. Lockdown wasn't exactly the worst idea during COVID history, but it's got to be taken with a pinch of salt because, look at how we've managed. In Australia, as soon as the vaccines came over, people started getting vaccinated. It was almost enforced on everybody. Nearly, large number of population, nearly everyone's vaccinated in Australia, and then people opened up. And China, it's too late to do this in China. I think that is my problem with China at the moment, that 3 years later, if you still haven't got your vaccines figured out, that is a problem. That is point A. 3 years later, if majority of your people are only 2 doses, and as Dr. Brown said, whether it's your Sinovac or inactivated vaccine or any other vaccine, you've got to have more than 2 doses now. And not just 2 doses. I mean, if you look at the data, nearly all the vaccines stop giving you protection after 3-4 months or 6 months at the max.
So in 3 years, a nation like China, if it cannot ramp up the infrastructure required to back its population at all levels, then it's something which does not fly. And you could impose everything else, not just on its own people, but across the world. But you could impose vaccination and inoculation. That argument also somehow does not fly. I've run out of time. I thank all our panelists. Thank you very much for joining us. The critical aspect remains that this nation, its leadership needs to be held accountable for what it's wrought upon humanity. We're going to wind up Viewpoint on that note. Biggest exclusive follows.